to the Cut Through podcast. I'm Simon Bohr, and this is how to communicate with clarity in a noisy world. Welcome to the Cut Through podcast. I'm Simon Bohr. This week, I want to take you through 10 behavioural science principles that I think every communicator should know. The number one rule of great communications is know your audience. Yet most communicators still design messages for how they wish people thought, not how they actually do. Decades of behavioral science research reveals that most human decisions are fast, emotional, and unconscious. So why are so many campaigns still written for the slow, logical brain? Here are my 10 behavioral science principles that every communicator should know, with my ranking from least to most important. Number 10 is framing and anchoring. Framing is where people's choices change depending on how options are presented, even where they are logically identical. For example, people are more likely to choose a surgical procedure with a 90% survival rate than choose one with a 10% mortality rate. It's the same fact, different framing, different response. Anchoring is where judgments are influenced by a reference point. So anyone buying a car or negotiating a salary should know that the starting point for that negotiation has a big influence on what feels like a reasonable settlement. Extraordinarily, anchors still have an effect, even when people know that the anchor is completely irrelevant. Let me give you an example. Participants in a study were asked to estimate the proportion of countries in the United Nations that are from Africa. Before estimating, the participants observed a roulette wheel that stopped on either the number 10 or the number 65. On average, those whose wheel stopped on 10 guessed that the answer was that 25% of UN countries were from Africa, whereas those whose wheel stopped on 65 guessed that the proportion was 45%. Discounts are a really common example of anchoring in communications. The original price serves as the anchor, and then the discounted one seems like a bargain. At number 9, I've got authority bias. Far from having had enough of experts, we actually trust and follow the lead of those that we perceive to be authority figures. In a disturbing experiment conducted by Stanley Milgram in the 1960s, participants were instructed by a researcher to administer what they thought were increasingly severe electric shocks to another participant when that person answered questions incorrectly. In reality, the person who appeared to be receiving the shocks was an actor, but the participants didn't know that. Despite hearing their screams, most continued to administer shocks when instructed to do so, demonstrating the powerful influence of authority figures on our actions. In a variation of the experiment, the obedience levels dropped from 65% to just 20% when the instruction to continue with the shocks was given by an ordinary member of the public wearing plain clothes rather than a researcher dressed in a lab coat. The experiment reveals our dangerous capacity to abandon our humanity when subject to institutional authority. But as well as being aware of the dangers, this bias can be applied for the public good. The Edelman Trust Barometer shows that people still trust scientists and teachers far more than they trust CEOs, politicians, or journalists. During the COVID pandemic, the Prime Minister was often flanked by the government's chief scientific advisor and the chief medical officer in press conferences. This wasn't only because they could answer the more technical questions, but also because their presence would make important public health advice more trustworthy to the audience. At number 8, I have commitment. Once people commit to something, publicly or privately, they're more likely to stick with it. If you've ever been asked at the end of a learning session to commit to one thing you will do differently next week, this is why. In the same way, a charity that persuades you to wear a small badge or wristband knows that your visible commitment makes you more likely to donate again later. So communicators who can create moments for audiences to say yes in small ways make bigger commitments more likely. Even after privately committing to a behavior, you feel psychological pressure to be consistent. This is why apps like Duolingo get you to commit to a certain number of lessons, tell you how many days of a learning streak you're on, and show you your place on a leaderboard. My wife and I once debated whether we should drive 12 kilometers in a remote part of Africa in the hope that she might be able to find mobile reception and keep her 263-week Peloton streak alive. Commitment can be a very powerful force. At number 7, I have defaults and nudge. Defaults are where people tend to stick with existing options. The most powerful example of this is the way that UK pensions have been transformed through auto-enrolment. Rather than asking people whether they wanted to opt into a workplace pension, the government changed the rules so that people were asked whether they wanted to opt out. This increased private sector pension membership from just 32% in 2012 to 75% by 2021. It increased annual pension contributions in the UK by an astonishing £20 billion. Nudge builds on defaults by arguing that making small changes in choice architecture can dramatically affect behavior. Some men's urinals have a small image of a fly etched into them. I could never work out why. The answer is that it reduces spillage because men instinctively aim at the target. Crude, but effective. Sometimes the best communication involves changing the environment so that people barely notice that they are being guided. Number 6 is habit and cues. Much of what our brain does is not the product of conscious choice, but of habit. Habits form when a cue in our environment triggers an automatic routine. So, for example, smokers light up when they have a coffee, commuters check their phone when they get on a train. For communicators, the opportunity is to either break habits or to use cues to create new ones. I was responsible for the Fire Kills campaign when I was at the Home Office. Testing a smoke alarm is a small task, but it's one which is easily put off. So by encouraging people to test their smoke alarm at the same time they changed their clocks twice a year, the campaign connected the activity to an existing cue in order to try and create a new habit. The Stoptober campaign attempts to break the habit of smoking, and it did so by creating a new moment in the year for people to stop smoking outside of the usual opportunity around the new year. It took the knowledge that smokers are 5 times more likely to stop for good if they make it to 28 days to try and create a month-long behavioural journey that felt more manageable to people than making a permanent commitment to quit. Number 5, loss aversion. We hate losing twice as much as we like winning. So, for example, if I told you, I'm going to toss a coin, if it's tails, you lose £10, how much would you have to gain on heads in order for you to take this gamble? The answer is that most people say they would expect at least £20 to consider it worth risking £10. That's twice the upside on what is a 50-50 bet. Loss aversion is why offers that must end soon are more effective in communications than that same offer being available permanently. Fear of missing out is a classic social media behavioural technique that plays on this principle. It also means that communications that focuses on negative consequences tends to be more motivating than those that focus on gains. People are more likely to be motivated by short-term pain than by long-term gain. At number 4, I have cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias. When people are confronted with information that conflicts with their existing beliefs, they experience real discomfort known as cognitive dissonance. In order to reduce that discomfort, they often dismiss or reinterpret the new information rather than change their mind. Confirmation bias reinforces this tendency, so we tend to give more weight to evidence that supports what we already believe, and we tend to discount what contradicts it. In experiments, people rate identical evidence as more credible when it supports their side of a debate. So, for example, during the COVID pandemic, people who either strongly supported or opposed lockdowns were more likely to interpret new data as proof that lockdowns did or didn't work rather than to change their minds. This is really important for communicators because it explains why seeking to change someone's beliefs by proving them factually wrong rarely works. If your message threatens someone's identity or worldview, it will just bounce off. The challenge is to find shared values or trusted messengers or trusted narratives that will allow people to update their existing beliefs without feeling attacked. You can't bludgeon people into changing their minds with data. You have to make it feel safe for them to do so. Number 3 is cognitive ease and availability. The easier something is to process, the more true and trustworthy it feels. So brevity is a secret to great communication. If you can turn your communications narrative into 3 paragraphs, then 3 sentences, and then 3 words, for example, get Brexit done, it won't only be more memorable, it will also be perceived as more important and more trustworthy. Availability bias is a mental shortcut, which means we tend to ascribe more importance to something that we can easily recall. And this applies to more than just messaging. So, for example, people overestimate the dangers of flying after hearing about a plane crash, even though driving may be riskier. The easier it is to recall the consequences of something, the greater those consequences are often perceived to be. At number 2, I have social proof. We are strongly influenced by what others are doing. This is one of the most powerful tools available to communicators. In fact, the whole of social media is pretty much based on it. In his book, Influence, Robert Cialdini explains how he discovered that a message telling hotel guests that the majority of guests who stay in our hotel reuse their towels resulted in a 28% increase in the number who chose not to have new towels. It was more effective as a message than any rational appeal, such as the environmental impact of washing towels. And if you think about it, this is really quite striking. The people did not personally know the other people who were reusing their towels, and they didn't have to interact with anyone, so there was no direct peer pressure to conform, but a simple change of message resulted in a drastic change in behavior when it was based on what other people were reportedly doing. Relatability and social identity theory take this further by arguing that we are more likely to be persuaded by people who we like, or who we identify with, or who we have interacted with previously. For communicators, this is really important. It means that the messenger matters as much as the message. And this is why brands work with content creators who are already trusted by the audience they're trying to reach. It's why a recommendation from a trusted friend can outweigh expert advice. And it's why we place weight on testimonials from people like us when we're buying goods or services. Number one is System 1 and System 2. You've probably heard of Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. In it, he explains how we use two modes of thought. System 1 is fast, intuitive, and emotional. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and logical. And most of the time, we default to System 1. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt described the interplay between our rational and emotional selves as like an elephant and the rider. The rider, sitting atop the elephant and holding the reins, appears to be in control. He or she represents our conscious, analytical, and rational brain. Our conscious mind can plan, reason, and make decisions. The elephant, on the other hand, is our intuitive and instinctive side, what's known as our limbic brain. It is driven by emotion, feelings, desires, gratification. While our rational side influences behavior and direction, it is our emotional side that is truly powerful. This matters for communication because making an argument solely to the rider, a rational argument based on facts or statistics, is unlikely to succeed over an argument built on emotion and instinct. Anytime the elephant and the rider disagree about which direction to go in, the elephant is going to win. So communicators need to design messages that work intuitively first and then back them up with rational evidence, not the other way around. These 10 principles reflect the way that our brains are wired, but the modern media environment amplifies their importance. In a world where algorithms shape attention and where trust is in short supply, communicators who know how to work with the grain of human psychology are more likely to cut through. In future posts, I'll explore some of these concepts in more detail, and more importantly, I'll show you some simple, practical frameworks for how to incorporate them into your next communications campaign. Until then, thank you very much for watching or listening. If you haven't yet subscribed, please do so, and please share with other communicators who want to lead with clarity and cut through the noise.